Latvia found a way to paralyze the Russian army without firing a single shot to pin it down where it stood. And the truly fascinating part is this: Vladimir Putin cannot even respond to it. What ties his hands is not a missile shield or a nuclear threat. It is the simple removal of cold steel rails. The story I want to tell you tonight is not about the loud, explosive face of modern warfare. On the contrary, it is a story of silence. I want you to visualize this. Imagine not looking at a map, but being in that moment. In the darkness of night, just across the border, you hear the sound of heavy machinery. Huge excavators dig into the ground with that ear-piercing noise of metal scraping against metal. But they are not building anything. They are not repairing anything. They are dismantling. On November 26, just a few days ago, Latvian President Rinkovics and Prime Minister Selina gathered around a table and signed a document that, from the outside, looked like a routine infrastructure decision. But when you read between the lines, you realize this is no simple transportation project. This is a long-term, multi-layered, and surprisingly cleverly crafted national defense doctrine. So why the rails? Why would a country tear up its own railways, its own infrastructure with its own hands? The answer lies in the geography itself and in the Russian army's DNA. The Russian army needs railways to transport its tanks, artillery, and massive ammunition stockpiles to the border as much as a human needs oxygen. Russian logistics get stuck on asphalt roads, bogged down in mud, but they flow on rails. The Latvian government realized this at the table. If you remove the rails, you don't just stop transportation. In a potential invasion scenario, you would break the backbone of the Russian army's logistics before the war even began. This is where a concept comes into play that we don't hear very often in military literature, but one we need to think long and hard about tonight: negative engineering. Let's elaborate on this a little, because this concept is the key element that makes what Latvia did so ingenious. In traditional warfare, what do you do to stop the enemy's advance? You blow up a bridge, right? But bombing a bridge is a casus belli under international law. That is a cause for war. Missiles fly through the air, sirens wail, the world rises up. The other side gains the right to attack you. But what happens if you remove a rail on your own territory? You explain it as maintenance costs. You say environmental regulations. Or you simply say, we are modernizing safety standards. This is a legal trap. Russia cannot respond militarily to this. Putin cannot turn to Latvia and declare war by asking, why did you remove your own rail? Not a single bullet has been fired yet, but the operational capability of the Russian army has been silently and profoundly crippled. This is Putin's famous gray zone tactics, which he has used against the West for years, now being used against him, and with his own favorite weapon, geography. And on the technical side, there is a detail that will surprise you even more. This is not just about the presence or absence of tracks. This is a mathematical battle over the width of the tracks. During the Soviet era, Moscow standardized the entire empire to a single gauge, 1,520 millimeters. The wheels of Russian military trains were specially cast for this width. In Europe, however, the tracks are narrower, at 1,435 millimeters. What Latvia is doing now by dismantling the Zilupe line, that main artery coming from Moscow, is actually erasing Russia's wide-gauge advantage from the map. This is not a simple route change. It is a logistical amputation operation. Latvia is not just removing the rails. It is digging up the embankments that line the track, rendering bridges unusable, and dismantling signaling systems. So even if Russia wanted to return one day, it would find no ground to march its army on. Rebuilding that line would cost billions of dollars and take years of work. Can you imagine? You wake up one morning and your neighbor hasn't just blocked the road to your house. They've erased it from the map, dug up the ground, and left an impassable void in its place. That's exactly what we'll be talking about tonight. This is the construction of the Baltic Wall. But this wall isn't made of bricks. It's woven from absence, emptiness, and silence. Now let's move a little further into that deep void created by the silence on the map, into that terrifying terrain they call the kill zone. Now let's mentally step back from that dark borderline and look at the map from above, from an eagle's eye view. Because what is happening here is not just the story of a single town or a single train station. A massive, invisible defensive wall is being built, stretching from Finland's icy, jagged coastline down to Poland's vast plains. But don't try to picture this wall with bricks or barbed wire. This is a wall built by breaking. Imagine Latvia's 283-kilometer border with Russia. Along that border, There were three main railway arteries that had sustained the Kremlin's logistical plans for years, functioning almost like a life support system. I say were, because what we are talking about now is the surgical severing of these arteries. The most critical of these is the Zilupe line, which is currently in the crosshairs. Keep this name in mind, Zilupe. This line was the main artery coming directly from Moscow, i.e. the center. To the north, there is the Karsava crossing. These lines were specially cast according to the 1,520 millimeter Soviet standard I mentioned earlier, specifically for the heavy, cumbersome wheels of Russian military trains. When Latvia removes these lines, it's not just removing the rails, it's breaking Russia's logistical backbone. So, how long does this physical removal process take? Actually, dismantling a railway line is not technically very difficult. A few machines, a few weeks, and the line is gone. But Latvia's plan is not that superficial. They are digging up the earthen embankments along the line. Those embankments are the only ground that allows the train to travel without sinking in the marshy terrain. They are rendering the bridges statically unusable. They are destroying the signal towers, that electronic nervous system. So even if Russia one day says, I'm going to lay tracks here again, it will be faced with a construction project costing billions of dollars and taking years to complete. It will not find a surface on which to move its army. Now let's turn our gaze a little further north to Estonia. There, the situation is even more dramatic, even a little more symbolic. Estonia's most critical link with Russia is the Narva crossing, that historic line to St. Petersburg, often mentioned in history books. Estonia had already rendered the line half dead when it closed the bridge to vehicle traffic. They piled up those pyramid-shaped concrete blocks, which they call dragon's teeth, to prevent tanks from passing. Now, completely cutting off the railway connection at the Kaidala point is on the table. There is tremendous coordination here. On the one hand, Latvia and Estonia are weaving a modern, fast railway network compatible with Europe and facing the West, namely the Rail Baltica project. On the other hand, they are blocking all lines facing the East, namely Russia. This is like slamming a massive door in Russia's face along the Baltic border. No entry, no key, not even a door handle. And in the south, the most complex part of the equation, Lithuania. But we'll get to that in a moment because Lithuania's situation is a whole other thriller. Right now, I want you to focus on the ground beneath those dismantled rails, that is the mud. And let's step out of those clean, air-conditioned rooms of military strategists for a moment and get down to the field, to the reality itself. The answer to the question, what happens when the rails are gone, lies at the heart of Russian military doctrine. The Russian army is a firepower army, and firepower literally means weight. Soviet doctrine relies on crushing the enemy not through maneuver, but by raining tons of ammunition down on them. Those artillery shells, those massive howitzers, those rocket systems, they are incredibly heavy. When there are rails, this weight flows like water. But when the rails are gone, that's when the Russian army is confined to wheeled vehicles, trucks, trailers, and wheeled vehicles fall into a trap in the Baltic geography where they will taste death. Picture the Baltic geography in your mind. It is endless forests, endless swamps, and soft, spongy ground. It is a nightmare for tanks. Throughout history, this geography has swallowed armies. When the rails are removed, Russian convoys are forced to channel themselves onto the limited number of asphalt roads marked on the map in advance to avoid entering those swamps. This is the deadly result of negative engineering, leaving the enemy with no options. This is a dream for the defending side. If you know which route the enemy must take and at what time, you wait for them there. Every meter of track removed drives Russian tanks into narrow death corridors called kill zones from which there is no escape. What awaits them there? NATO's precision-guided HIMARS missiles, anti-tank systems, and the new nightmare of modern warfare, FPV drones. What Latvia is doing is turning geography into a weapon. By removing the tracks, they are turning Russia's famous blitzkrieg, lightning war dream, into a mud-bound, slow-moving, and easily hunted logistical nightmare. This action is essentially equivalent to laying thousands of mines along the border. The only difference is that Latvian diplomats have the luxury of standing at the United Nations podium, wearing innocent expressions and saying, "We are just modernizing our infrastructure. We are not attacking anyone." This is called winning without fighting. Removing the rails shuts down Russia's power projection right at the 0 point of the border, like flipping a switch. And this decision is taken so seriously that Latvia will not finalize it until early 2026, because they first requested a military analysis of this disappearance from the National Armed Forces. In other words, they are calculating, if we remove this rail, where exactly, in which hole, will we trap Russia? But the story doesn't end there. Because when you cut the veins of an organism, you don't just end its ability to move. You also cut off its energy. And I'm talking about the electricity flowing through Putin's veins. There's a move in the pipeline that will extinguish not only the trains, but also the lights. And this is just as devastating as the tracks. Now let's move away from the metallic industrial clatter of the tracks. Let's listen to a much more insidious, much quieter, but much more deadly sound. Can you hear it? The faint hum of your refrigerator, the crackle of the street lamp, that electric buzz in the background of the city, the invisible pulse of modern life. We've grown accustomed to it. We assume that when we press a button, the light will turn on, the boiler will work, our phone will charge. It's as natural to us as air or water. But for people living in the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, this hum has not been a guarantee for decades, but a cold, threatening breath on the back of their necks. Because the frequency of that electricity, the rhythm of that energy was determined not from their own capitals, but from a control room hundreds of kilometers away, in Moscow. It's not just the rails that are being cut off. The electricity in Putin's veins is being cut off too. Let's examine this invisible chain a little closer. They call it the BRELL network. It sounds like the name of an innocent energy company, doesn't it? But in reality, it's one of the last living ghosts of the Cold War. BRELL, Belarus, Russia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Established in the 1950s and 60s, this massive network was a marvel of Soviet engineering. But its purpose was not to serve the people. Its purpose was full integration. More accurately, it was assimilation that made escape impossible. Moscow had tied the Baltic countries' electricity systems to itself so tightly that even if these countries gained political independence in 1991, they would never achieve energy independence. Consider this. A Russian power plant in Smolensk supplied electricity to a hospital in Tallinn. The entire region was locked into Moscow's fixed 50 hertz frequency. Their hearts had to beat in time with Moscow's. Do you know why this is terrifying? Because it was not a service contract, but a tool of political domination. With a single phone call from the Kremlin, a single order, the Baltic capitals could be plunged into darkness on the coldest day of winter. You can't say they wouldn't do that, because they did. This isn't a theoretical horror movie scenario. Russia has played this blackmail card many times. Remember, the winter of 2006. When they fell out with Ukraine, they turned off the taps. In 2009, Bulgaria and Romania shared the same fate. When the war began in 2022, they cut off gas to Poland and Bulgaria, which refused to pay in rubles. For Russia, energy is not a commodity to be sold, but a bullet loaded into the chamber. It is an invisible shackle. Consider for a moment the chilling analogy of the Lithuanian prime minister. Staying in the BRELL network is equivalent to handing Moscow a loaded gun and pressing it to your own temple. Breaking this bond was not a choice, but a matter of survival. Because what happens when the lights go out? You don't just become unable to read books at home. Let's delve a little deeper into the scenario. The vital machines in hospitals stop. The alarms in the incubators in the neonatal units begin to sound shrill in the darkness. Operating rooms go dark. That thin green line of life in intensive care suddenly flattens. Cities' water pumps run on electricity. When the pumps stop, the taps run dry. One night, suddenly, thirst, freezing cold, and complete chaos begin. That's why what Lithuania did on September 19th was historic. It was the definition of courage. They dismantled all the Russian energy lines left over from the Soviet era. Without firing a single bullet using that same legal trap method, they dismantled their own infrastructure. But the real big break, the real grand finale, is coming soon. Mark your calendars, because this date will go down in European history. February 8th, 2025. This date will be known in Baltic history books as the Second Independence Day. What will happen that day? That day, the Baltic grids will completely disconnect from the Russian system, from that 50 hertz Moscow rhythm, desynchronization. They will hold their breath for a moment, operating in isolated mode. And immediately afterwards, they will synchronize with the massive European ENTSO-E network. This is like changing a nation's blood type, a biological transplant. For ordinary people on the streets of Vilnius, Riga, and Tallinn, this means that the control switch for their lights, their heating, their children's future is no longer in the hands of an unpredictable autocrat in Moscow. They are now part of that secure, massive network spanning 34 countries, with hubs in Brussels, Paris, and Warsaw. The engineering behind this operation is mind-boggling. Estonia has modernized the S-Link 2 undersea connection with Finland to the north, increasing its capacity to 650 megawatts. This is a gateway to Scandinavia's abundant energy. To the south is Poland. Poland has become the main anchor of this system, the safe harbor in the storm, by laying billions of euros worth of cable. Scandinavia in the north, Europe in the south. The Baltics are emerging from Russia's dark corridor and connecting to the light of the West. For years, Russia propagated the message, we protect you, we give you cheap energy. But in the end, the Baltic countries saw a bitter truth. The energy Russia offered was dependence, and dependence inevitably turns into a weapon one day. Now let's complete this picture. The rails have been torn up, the logistical backbone has been broken, the power lines have been cut, the energy arteries have been dried up. What remains? A piece of land left alone on the map, surrounded, unable to breathe. Russia's proud stronghold in Europe, Kaliningrad. What I have described so far was for defense. It was a message saying, stay away from us. But what I am about to describe is the story of how these defensive moves turned into an attack, into a death trap with no escape for Russia. Now, it's time to focus on that last lonely piece on the map. Everything I've described, those rusty rails being torn up, those high voltage lines being cut, those cold concrete blocks lining the border, all point to one thing. They are all moves made to produce a single result, like dominoes knocking each other over. I want to take you to Kaliningrad. This is no ordinary piece of land. When you look at the map, you see a strange anomaly. Completely cut off from mainland Russia, squeezed between Poland and Lithuania, 2 NATO members. It stands alone on the shores of the Baltic Sea, an island. Do you remember how the Kremlin marketed this place for years, for decades? A dagger plunged into the heart of the West, an unsinkable aircraft carrier. They stockpiled Iskander missiles there, anchored the Baltic fleet there. Kaliningrad was Putin's shielded fist threatening Europe. But now that fist has turned into a hand that strangles its owner. Latvia and Lithuania removing those rails, that seemingly simple maintenance work, turned Kaliningrad into the largest, best equipped, but most helpless hostage in history. Let's take a closer look at how this hostage-taking operation unfolded, how that invisible noose tightened, because the devil is in the details. The boldest, quietest player in this story is Lithuania. Let's go back to November 21st. That day, Lithuanian Railways made what appeared to be an extremely boring, bureaucratic announcement. They said, we are halting the transit of cargo belonging to the Russian oil giant Lukoil to Kaliningrad. Why? An embargo? A declaration of war? No. The reason given was risk management. You have to tip your hat to the coolness of this statement, this diplomatic sarcasm. We are not being hostile. We are simply not transporting cargo that we consider risky in accordance with our company policies, they said. This is the new language of modern warfare. But the real-world translation of this decision is this: putting pressure on Kaliningrad's lifeline. Because the fuel Lukoil was transporting in those wagons wasn't just gasoline for civilians' cars in Kaliningrad. That fuel was a lifeline. Kaliningrad is an energy-isolated region. That fuel powers the generators in hospitals. That fuel kept the city's electricity grid running. Ambulances ran on that fuel. And most critically, Russian army barracks, those huge ammunition depots, were heated with that fuel. When Lithuania made this decision, it confronted the Russian garrison with a simple but terrifying reality. Winter is coming and you could freeze. An army without fuel, light, or heat cannot fight. It can only try to survive. And right at this point, geography's cruel revenge comes into play. The infamous Suwalki Corridor. Anyone interested in military strategy knows this name. That 60-mile-long, narrow, flat stretch of land on the border between Poland and Lithuania. For years, NATO generals looked at this map and sweated. They feared if Russia closes this area, the Baltic countries' link to Europe will be severed. This area was known as NATO's Achilles heel. But Latvia's plan to remove the rails turned this equation upside down. It overturned the table. How? Think about it. When the railway connection is severed, when the rails are removed, what will Russia do to supply Kaliningrad to bring food, ammunition, and boots to its soldiers there? There are no trains. Only one option remains, the highway, and that is the narrow, indefensible Suwalki corridor. Russia is now forced to pile all its logistics, all its supplies into this bottleneck controlled by NATO members Lithuania and Poland, where every inch is monitored and can be closed off with a barricade at any moment. The corridor that NATO once feared has now turned into a death tunnel where Russian convoys will be trapped and hunted down like partridges from the air and on the ground. This is a move that raises logistical and military pressure to astronomical levels. What was Putin's greatest fear? NATO solidarity. What he is experiencing now is the realization of that fear as a nightmare scenario. Because Poland and Lithuania are waiting, holding the mouth of that corridor, Kaliningrad is no longer a fortress threatening Europe. Kaliningrad is now a death trap under NATO siege, its logistical arteries severed, its electricity at the mercy of its neighbors gasping for breath. And when we look at the big picture, we see the failure of Vladimir Putin's grand strategy. Remember, this whole process began with the invasion of Ukraine and the claim to protect the Russian world. Putin claimed that with his near-abroad doctrine, he would preserve Russian influence, the Russian language, and Russian hegemony in the former Soviet geography. What was the result? The result was a complete boomerang effect. His aggression frightened and angered his neighbors so much that they burned not only political bridges, but also physical ones. Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania severed ties with Russia, accepting the commercial damage and destroying billions of dollars worth of infrastructure. This is not just a halt in trade, this is a physical expulsion. Russia is being physically expelled from Europe, and there is an even deeper disconnect, a mental disconnect. Even the Russian origin population in the Baltic countries, whom the Kremlin has called our people for years, is turning its face away from Moscow and toward Brussels as it witnesses this aggression. The Kremlin's propaganda no longer works, because people prefer the security of the NATO umbrella to Putin's chaos. Putin destroyed the sphere of influence he claimed to protect with his own hands. In short, my friends, Putin's vital land supply routes to his Baltic targets have been wiped out, never to be reopened. This is a military disaster inflicted on Russia at its own expense, on its own territory. As we close the program, I want to leave you with a thought about the bigger meaning of this story. Throughout human history, we have always defined civilization through connectivity. We have built roads since the Romans. We laid rails during the Industrial Revolution. Then we laid fiber optic cables. We believed that the more we connected, the more we traded, the more impossible war would become. We said, those who trade do not fight. But when we look at that deep void left by the torn-up rails in that foggy, muddy terrain on the Latvian border, perhaps we are facing the new and frightening reality of the 21st century. Perhaps security now lies not in connection, but in disconnection. Perhaps the greatest power of a modern nation is not to build a bridge, but to be able to destroy that bridge on its own side quietly, lawfully, and coolly when necessary. Latvia showed us this. Sometimes you don't have to attack to win. Sometimes to win, it is enough to simply destroy the paths your enemy can use to reach you and leave them alone with their own weight, their own arrogance. Tonight, listen closely to the silence of those dismantled rails, because that silence speaks of something far more powerful than the sound of cannons. This is the sound of an era coming to an end. I'm Nicole. Thank you for listening, for thinking, and for being with us. Don't forget to watch us and subscribe. And until next time, stay safe.